Hey, Joe here from Home Studio Corner. I made my first album in high school, and it was atrocious. 8 songs, made a little CD, printed labels. The album was called Joseph Gilder. I was Joseph in high school. Being from a small town, Yazoo City, Mississippi, it was kind of a big deal. Nobody had put out a CD of people that I knew, so everyone thought it was amazing, and I thought that I was amazing, but it wasn't really that amazing. In fact, my senior class, which was like 30 people, voted to use one of my songs as our senior class song. So of course everyone wanted a copy, so I was busy printing CDs and stamping on the labels and putting them in the jewel case and selling them all over town. And one thing I always thought about, I would get in my car and drive around and of course listen to myself over and over, because that's what us self-absorbed musicians do. I noticed that the volume of my CD wasn't as loud as the other CDs that I would listen to. Or I'd be listening to my CD and I'd crank that volume knob as far to the right as it would go, and I could just kinda hear it okay. And if I didn't remember to turn it back down when I switched over to the radio, I would blow myself out. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had pushed the volumes of the tracks in my session as loud as I could get them without making the clip light go off. So as far as I was concerned, that was it. I made it as loud as I could possibly make it. As it turns out, this is a really common problem among home studio folks like you and me. We record something, we get it all in there, we mix it down, we print it to a CD or we put it on our MP3 player, we go and listen in the car, and we have to crank up the volume just to hear it. Everything else we play is nice and loud, but ours is quiet. So we go back in and try to move things up, but as soon as we move things up, something starts to clip, so it seems like it's impossible to get that kind of volume, so we feel stuck. The answer, of course, is a limiter. What is a limiter? A limiter is simply something you slap on the end of your mix, at the very end of the chain on your master fader, and it does not let anything by. It's kind of like Gandalf. You shall not pass! You put the limiter here and say, this is as loud as you go, and then you can turn up the volume into that limiter, and it will not let it go past this level. What does that mean? That means you can set the limiter just below the level of clipping, and then you can turn all the rest of the audio up, and it won't clip, but it'll get louder. Of course, there are audio side effects to this. Whenever that limiter clamps down on the volume that does try to cross the threshold, it does change the sound a little bit, but that's one of the trade-offs to using a limiter. We get the volume that we need, and we sacrifice maybe a little bit of clarity and a little bit of dynamics, but the trade-off is good as long as you don't go too loud. Now, this video is not about mastering. Mastering involves using a limiter, but that's something for another day. What I'm talking about here is simply getting the volume of your mix or your export or your bounce down, whatever you want to call it, up to a level where you can hear it and it's in the same ballpark as the other music you listen to. That's going to be important, especially when you start working with other people. If you have someone come record and then you give them a bunch of mixes of the stuff you recorded, if your mixes are way quieter than everything else they listen to, even if you explain it super well that it has to be mastered first and that's going to make up for that volume, they're still going to have a weird feeling about it. So it makes sense to use some sort of a limiter to get the volume up. You don't have to slam it. You don't have to make it as loud as possible. Just get it in the ballpark. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do today. Okay, I've got 2 mixes pulled up here in Studio One. What I'm going to show you today is how I use the stock tools in PreSonus Studio One to do this. As long as you have a limiter of some sort in your system, you can do this. The specifics will be slightly different, but the concept's the same. You can figure it out in your system. To the left, this blue track is the class song from high school. And this one on the right is my song Fighter that I released last year in my latest EP called Fighter. Great, one of my favorite songs I've ever done. The one on the left, maybe not. So let me just show you really quickly what I was talking about. So here's what, as much as I don't want to play this for you, here's what that high school track sounds like. This is with the volume set to how I normally listen to music in here. This is the volume level that this track is coming in.
Winds of change blow strong, bringing what they may.
The winds of change blow strong, bringing what they may. I mean, poet. And so you can see it gets louder as we go. Here's kind of the bigger part of the song. One thing you may notice, I didn't know what panning was. I am rocking a very mono mix. Background vocals, percussion, guitar, vocal, all right up the middle. As you can imagine, if you were listening to this in your car, you would crank up the volume to be able to hear it well. And then when the next song came along, if it was mastered to a decent level, it would blow your speakers out. Here's the volume difference between the two. Here's the end of that song.
Just won't wait anymore.
And then here's the next one, which is going to be louder. Turn your speakers down a little bit. So it's not the biggest difference in the world. I've heard quieter mixes, right? But look at the difference just looking at the waveforms. This one on the left is not the same as the one on the right. Now, the one on the right isn't super slammed, I promise. It's been mastered to a reasonable level, so that's probably a quieter master than you're used to listening to, because I don't like to master things really loudly, but there's still a big volume difference. So what's the formula to make my mix at least stand up to a mastered mix, so that when I listen to it in my car, I don't have to crank up the volume, and when I send it to clients, they're not asking me what's wrong because it's so much quieter than everything else in their library? The solution, of course, as I mentioned before, is a limiter. I'm going to grab the limiter out of the plugin list over here. The one in Studio One is called Limiter. Now, what I like about the limiter in Studio One, it's very simple to use, and it gives me a couple of tools that are going to help me get this to the level that it needs to be. So the first thing is it has an input gain. So there's a ceiling, a threshold, a release, and an input gain. That's a volume knob over here. First thing you want to do is set the ceiling and the threshold. I set them both to -1. If 0 is clipping, -1 is a little bit below that. What happens with a limiter, even though it is technically a brick wall limiter and it's not letting anything by setting it to -1, we're giving ourselves a little bit of a buffer, because sometimes the signal does cross the threshold a little bit. And if the threshold is right at 0 dB, right at the maximum volume you can have in a digital system, then anything that crosses is going to cause clipping. So by bringing it down to -1, we're giving ourselves a little bit of a buffer, which makes it much less likely, even if we slam the limiter, that any of those peaks are actually going to cross over into technically clipping. What I like to do is set the ceiling and threshold to -1. The release is here at 30 milliseconds. And I start turning up the input until I get to the desired volume. Now, when I first started out, the way I did this, I'll hit play for a second. The way I handled this was I just turned it up until I got some limiting happening. Not a great approach. So I would literally do this. Turn it up. You can't hear it right now. I've got it muted. And I would just crank it until I saw something happening on the limiter. So you can see there's some gain reduction happening. And I'd say, well, that seems 12 dB of gain reduction seems like too much. So let me pull it back and maybe till there's like 6 dB. Completely arbitrary. It's not taking into account any sort of standard for volume, which means if I did every song like this, I'd still have a pretty wide difference in volume across the different songs that I mix. And there's a chance I'm over compressing this because I'm just randomly picking a thing and not paying attention to the actual level measurement itself and what the limiter's doing to the sound. Here's what this sounds like when we just crank it up too much. This is called over-limiting. Yeah, I can't even listen to that anymore. Aside from the fact that it's a horrible mix, it's over-limited and it's too much. So my solution is to literally, you can do this without even listening. And then obviously go back and listen to make sure. But I usually set levels for things really mathematically for this type of work, and then go back and listen to make sure it sounds okay. So the hero of the day is this K14 meter. This is the K-system metering that has become pretty popular, and Studio One has incorporated that into its limiter, and you can also get it on the main outputs as well, on the actual fader, on your master fader. So the way the K-system metering works is it measures the average level, and it gives you a target to aim for. So right now, as I'm playing this mix as it's coming through, it's on a K20 meter, it's actually hanging out right around 0, which is actually what I shoot for when I'm mixing a normal song. So without any limiting, I want it to hang out right there. That means I've got plenty of headroom. I don't have to compress heavily to keep anything from clipping. I've got plenty of headroom above that 0 point to let the mix breathe. For mastering, however, I want to use the K14 meter. That's another basically 6 dB louder essentially. And when I have things at 0 on the K14 meter, typically that means something is clipping. So I need a limiter in place to not let those clips go through, so I can turn up the volume and then turn down the loudest parts. So what I do here is I'm listening and I'm looking, and I just turn up the volume until that meter is hitting around 0 on a K14 meter consistently. So where basically the whole song is at or above that 0 mark. So if I stop playback for a second and go to the quieter section at the beginning of the song, we can see it's pretty low. So what I'll do is turn this up until it's pretty close to that 0 mark, because 0 is kind of what I'm aiming for. And then the louder sections of the song get up into the yellow and the red. The red's not clipping, it just means you're at the louder parts of the song. So now it's at a much louder point. If I go over here and listen to the loudest section of the song, I can see it's getting into the red and it's limiting a little bit, but the limiter's actually still not working very hard. If we fade it in and listen to it now,
It's time to open up those wings and fly.
it's pretty reasonable. There's a little bit of distortion happening because it's a crappy guitar recorded through a crappy mic. So I'll bring the volume down a little bit, but I think that distortion was on the front end with the microphone, and there's more low end here. There's lots of problems here. But if we're just strictly talking about increasing the volume, this is how you do it. So now if we listen to this one,
Looking down the road.
it still sounds bad, but it's the same volume as this one.
Where you can go.
Now it just exposes how bad the first mix sounds, but at least it's loud enough to play ball with everything else in your iTunes playlist. I'll be the first to acknowledge that wasn't the simplest way to do it. It's a little more complicated, but that's the way that I make sure I get my mixes to a consistent level when I'm exporting them out for listening. You can do it a simpler way by simply putting a limiter and turning up the volume. That's better than nothing. Or you can bring in some sort of a reference. So one of your favorite professionally mixed and mastered mixes, bring that into your session and then turn the volume of yours up until it matches that and use a limiter to keep it from clipping. That's legit too. Or maybe you set a consistent volume on your volume knob, and that's the volume that you listen to things at. And when you're listening to your mix versus a professional mix, you realize yours is quieter, so you turn it up into the limiter and switch back and forth until those are at similar volumes. All of those are legit ways to do this. I like the K-system approach because it gives me a number to shoot for, and then I can listen and adjust, but I'm always shooting for that number, so I find that any mix that I've produced in the last few years, even if it's not a final master, just a mix that I exported to go listen in my car and on earbuds, they're all at a pretty consistent volume, which for me is helpful, so I'm always listening at the same volume, so I'm making decisions based on listening at the same volume, which is what we're talking about. So they're louder and they're all consistent, and those are two good things when you're talking about listening to mixes elsewhere. Last thing, if you want to practice what you saw here and do a lot of mixing and get a lot better, you should check out Dueling Mixes. We do a free 14-day trial, so head to duelingmixes.com. You can check it out, poke around, do some mixing completely for free, and then decide if it's right for you. You should know we do a new mix every month, but you also get access to the backlog of mixes that we've done every month since we launched. That's like 50 or 60 songs waiting for you to mix. So go check it out. You might love it. duelingmixes.com. See ya.